Thank you, Eloise, and a warm welcome to all of our participants joining today's event. I'm calling in from the land of the Brinja Yuin people of Maruya and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land. We're living in times of drastic change, including the rise of inequality, climate change, and the rapid development of digital technologies. Last year, New South Wales was clouded with the smoke of the bushfires, and we swapped out those masks for the ones that we're now wearing because of COVID-19. There is significant demand to solve for these problems, and youth are disproportionately affected by these problems as well. And they have continued to remain at the forefront as seen through the climate protest movement pre-COVID and the rise of artistic activism and memes that we see today. I'm Anorah John from Gen A, and I'm part of WWF-Australia. I lead Impactio, a WWF-owned venture that enables collaboration at scale to accelerate innovation for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Today, I have the absolute pleasure of sitting down with two senior MPs from both sides of politics to understand the ways in which major Australian parties are engaging youth at the senior policy and decision-making level. We're honoured to be joined today by Dave Sharma MP, federal member for Wentworth, former diplomat and ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dave.
It's a pleasure, Anorah. Thank you for having me join you.
Great. So to kick off, we're living in a time of significant global shift. What is your party's take on why young people should be engaged in the policy-making process, including reimagining our relationships in the region?
Well, look, there's a couple of reasons. I guess, I could give you the very cliched answer that young people are our future, but that has ever been thus and always been the case. So I might give you a more specific answer. I think one interesting phenomenon is that the younger generations, just as the way demographics in Western societies work and the size of them, are almost rivaling now the current biggest generation, the baby boomers generation. So I'm in one of these interregnum generations, whereas I think the younger generation, Gen Y and Gen Z, are actually quite large numerically. They're increasingly represented in the workforce, they're increasingly represented in society, and increasingly as time goes on, they'll be represented in positions of leadership. So if you want to think about where the cultural and the economic centre of gravity is of our society today, and this is true of, generally we're speaking, Western nations with the same demographic profile, it's the baby boomers who still have a pretty outsized influence in our political debates, but obviously that wanes over time. And then it's the younger generations. And I think that's why their voice is so important. There's a few other points to note. I mean, I think every generation brings with it its own set of values and beliefs and priorities. And I think my own sense of this generation is that it is doing exactly the same thing, but because of its size and its willingness to engage, I think, in political debates, partly enabled by technological tools, partly enabled by social media, means that these values will have a particular imprint on what the future of our country looks like. And I think that's a really good thing. It's a really positive thing. And I think in today's world, there are more avenues for younger generations of people to make their presence felt and make their voice heard. And in many respects, because of their more technologically literate nature, they're actually better than older generations who still write letters to newspaper editors or put out a press release or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that point, how can we continue to genuinely co-design with those disproportionately affected by policy?
Well, I think, politicians in a society like ours, anyway, in Australia, we're quite intuitive people and empirical people. So we like data in the sense that we're always looking for what's on people's minds, what are people talking about, what are their concerns, what are their preoccupations. And a large part of what I do on a day-to-day level is just to try and find that out, and in normal times it might be, standing on a street corner or outside a shopping centre. It's always on a digital platform. You're always engaging digitally. These days, more and more, it's doing Zoom calls. I'm also getting, traditional things like that. But part of the art of politics is just to understand what your community is feeling about things. And I think younger people are really good, actually, at expressing their voice and sentiments, either through physical activity, protest movements. You mentioned the climate protest movement, the school strike for climate, but also other things like just digital memes and digital channels where young people often produce the content that is, the most captivating, the most visually rich, whatever it is. And that all finds its way to us as politicians. Now, it's not particularly structured, but then a lot of politics isn't particularly structured in the sense that, we're influenced by the last person that spoke to us. We're influenced by the loudest voice in the room. We're influenced by, we take a sample and project it out, and it may or may not be a representative sample. So I think, but as long as you've got a voice in that debate and you're engaging with it, you're being heard, and your views are being considered.
Yeah, that's really comforting to hear, without a doubt. Now, millennials and Gen Zs are leading the charge when it comes to advocating for our climate, as you've mentioned. And as climate change is an issue that will affect younger generations more adversely, how will you, as a senior member of the Liberal Party, ensure that their voices are heard and count?
So I think, for me, I take that responsibility very seriously. And I think every elected representative on any side of politics has a sense of their custodianship. We hold a public office. We effectively hold it as a trustee of some sort. We've got a fiduciary responsibility to that office, and we're conscious that together we want to make sure that we leave the country and our society and whatnot in as good a shape, if not better shape, for future generations. I think most elected representatives think of things that way, and I think climate change is an obvious. There's a number of issues where I have worries. Housing affordability is one. Technological disruption on jobs, which may or may not be a positive thing. It's hard to know, but that's also something that's going to weigh more heavily on future generations. And then climate change, I think, most pertinently. I think part of the challenge, if you like, is there is a generational divide in views about the importance of this issue. And it's not surprising. There is on any number of issues. But obviously, to put it bluntly, people who aren't going to be around so long discount the future more heavily than people who are looking out 50 or 60 or 70 years into the future. And that's part of the difficulties with this problem, because effectively, when you're addressing problems in a society, you want to have sort of equity within that society in terms of what people contribute, but you also want to have intergenerational equity, which means that you're not putting burdens on this generation disproportionately to service the next generation, but conversely, you don't want this generation to get off lightly and shift all the burdens downwind to the next generation. And I think this is an issue where there's quite a generational divide within Australia about what level of policy change we should be making, how ambitious it should be with our targets, and what level of disruption we want to accept to our lifestyle in order to meet those targets. And I think, look, young people have a very important role to play in that. And I think it's important that they continue to push the level of ambition on this, because without young people making their voices heard, I think the default policy option is always going to be suboptimal for what we need to do.
Yeah, okay. And just extending on that, in relation to youth engagement and now exploring the theme on trust, according to Edelman's trust barometer reports, trust in government has fluctuated materially in the last 2 years. And this often reflects the way that disruptive events have been handled, such as the bushfires and COVID-19, to name a few. Given that there is a correlation between levels of trust and youth engagement, how does your party build trust with millennials and Gen Zs?
Look, it's a challenge. I mean, I'd say that the decline in trust of government is broadly Western phenomenon. It's not restricted to Australia. And I must say, in a global context, Australian institutions are still more trusted than their overseas counterparts. So we have less loss of faith in kind of government broadly, and broader trust in our institutions and the integrity of our institutions than other Western countries. And we tend to have less polarisation to it. And I think they're all positives, but it doesn't mean I think they should be taken for granted by any stretch. I think what I often say to people is that we all get the political system we deserve, and the quality of our political system reflects in some measure the level of engagement the public has with it, because the political system is not owned by someone else, it's owned by the public, and the quality of it in part reflects the level of engagement and level of participation. So, I often, you encounter people who have lost trust in politics or lost faith or are disenchanted with politics, and they sort of have an attitude of, look, a pox on all your houses. I'm not going to be bothered to be engaged in it. But that's a recipe, if you extrapolate that out and everyone has that attitude, well, you're going to get a much worse political system, and you're going to get a worse quality of politician, and you're going to get worsening institutions. So I always encourage people to make their voices heard, get involved politically. That doesn't mean you have to join a mainstream political party. You can join a group or like the WWF or any number of issues-based groups that is interested in campaigning for something, and play a role in helping the policy process, because ultimately the more people that opt in politically, the better our system will be. The more people that opt out, the worse our system will be.
Well, the level of engagement is obviously going to be reflected by how heard people feel. And so how can young people feel heard? Like where are you listening to us?
Yeah, well, so I think, look, so I'd make 2 points. Firstly, I think politicians are always listening. People may not always feel heard, but that's a different proposition, because I notice in my job that sometimes I listen to people, but if I don't agree with them, they don't feel like they're heard. Well, that's not necessarily a concomitant part of it, because I listen to voices all the time, and it would be impossible in my job for me to agree with all of them, because the voices are as diverse and varied as Australia is, and you'd expect that in a society as heterogeneous and pluralistic as ours is. So I think sometimes people mistake the fact that politicians aren't doing what they demand of them as that they're not being heard or they're being ignored. They're not. But the job of a politician is to sort of integrate all of these views and try and find a way ahead in a political sense. I mean, there's this saying that politics is the art of the possible, but it's entirely true. So I would urge people to not mistake the fact that everything isn't being done that they want to be done, as that doesn't mean they're being ignored. And I'd encourage them to continue to make their voices heard. How do they know they're being heard? Well, look, in my experience, look, I meet young people all the time. I'm always encouraging people to contact me or be in touch on social media. I tend to try and engage on that platform as much as I can. But I'm also always happy. I mean, there's very few politicians who, if you ask them to something, they won't turn up, physically or virtually. If you say, I've got me and 20 friends who are university or young professionals or starting out or school age, and we want you to come and we want to quiz you about stuff, I'm almost certain that every politician would accept that opportunity, because that's their role, and they're always out and interested in meeting and talking to people. So we're always out trying to seek views and solicit views and hear opinions, but it's also, I think, your job to say, hey, we've got a delegation coming to Canberra, we want to come and visit you in Parliament, or hey, we've got a group that wants to meet and talk about this, you should come and meet with us. Because any invitation that I get like that, I will take, because it's, one, it's part of my job, but two, it's how I do my job. Because if I don't have those inputs, I don't know what the community is thinking, and I don't have an answer for what people are thinking. And I would say this: sometimes the level of disengagement amongst younger people is higher than it should be, and higher than it is amongst older people. So they often don't want to take those opportunities, or they don't find a reason to, do those sorts of things. They're happy sort of complaining, but they don't necessarily want to fix it. And the onus here is to find a way to put your view forward. And as I said, most politicians will always take that opportunity and listen to those views.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And just shifting the topic a little bit towards the Asia front, a key but often overlooked asset in our regional engagement is our Asian Australian communities. What is your party's position on multiculturalism, and how is it responding to the growing incidence of racial discrimination during the pandemic?
So look, I think Australia is one of the most successful multicultural nations in the world. And I think what makes us unique in many respects is our identity, if you like, our national identity is not tied to place of birth or soil or, country of origin or religious affiliation or anything else like that. I think people can take that for granted in Australia, but it's quite unusual amongst the world. Most countries around the world still have a strong blood and soil nationalism to them, that if you're not from that country, you don't look like people from that country. You might be allowed to live there, but you're never going to be sort of fully accepted as one of them. And in Australia, people who arrive in their own generation or one generation or two generations here are as fully accepted as legitimate members of the Australian community as anyone else. So I think that's a great strength of our society, that we anyone can kind of partake in the Australian identity and be as Australian as anyone else. But that said, I don't think we should take it for granted. And I am worried. I think the pandemic has given rise to some growing incidents of racism. To be honest, geopolitical tensions with China and our relationship with China has also, I know, made members of the Chinese Australian community feel uncomfortable or feel some hostility directed towards them. We had that in the early 2000s when Islamist terrorism was a phenomenon, when Australians of Islamic faith and Middle Eastern Australians also felt like they were being treated with undue suspicion or were made to feel unwelcome. So it's something we need to deal with and combat in every cohort and with every generation, and we should never take it for granted. But generally speaking, I think we do quite a good job of that, but we need to make sure that continues. And look, our relationship with China is not going to get easier in the foreseeable future. I don't know if it'll get harder, but it's not going to get easier. And I've been particularly focused on making sure that we all make a distinction, as we should, between foreign relations between two countries and citizens of Australia. We shouldn't link. We should never hold citizens of Australia accountable or responsible in any sense for their country of origin. We've always been quite big in people don't import their geopolitical tensions into Australia when they migrate here, but equally we shouldn't do that as a society by saying, you're from this country, we're having problems with these countries, hence we're going to treat you differently. That's absolutely not the Australian way, and it's not how we've succeeded as a multicultural nation.
Well, in a similar vein, as our borders remain closed, geopolitical tensions rise, and Asian studies and research programs are being scaled down in our universities. Are you worried that we're going to lose a generation of Australian leaders familiar with the region, seeing as people who may not choose to study Asia or go to Asia to study, work, or live?
Yeah, look, I am worried. I don't think we're at the point where we're going to lose a generation. We've probably lost a number, though, because they haven't had the opportunity to travel or study abroad for this year or for last year that they would have otherwise had. And obviously, if this went on for significantly longer, yes, we could lose a generation to it. What I am encouraged about, though, is that I think younger generations of Australians are quite intrepid. They're quite curious intellectually. They're interested in different cultures. They're much more worldly and much less insular than their previous generations of Australians. And partly that's the impact of technology and ease of travel, and partly it's the lower cost of communications and travel. But I think we've got a real Australians do like getting out and exploring and getting to know the world and spending time abroad and studying abroad and working abroad, and that's a positive thing. So I'm confident once this pandemic is lifted and restrictions are back to normal, and I'm pretty hopeful that 2022 will look much more normal than 2021 did or 2020 did. That will return. One thing, though, I do worry, and this is a pre-pandemic point, is that interest and curiosity about our immediate region is still not as high as it should be in Australia, and most of our expertise still comes from people who've migrated from those regions. So most of our Mandarin speakers are Chinese Australians who've second generation or first generation, but it's also true for our Bahasa speakers and our Vietnamese speakers and everything else. And there's still, look, I love the UK, I love the US, but there's still far too many Australians who go there to London and New York and places like that, where, look, it's good for them, but it doesn't pay us a geopolitical dividend. It doesn't do anything for us geopolitically. Relations with those countries are fine. Where we need stronger people-to-people ties is countries like Indonesia, countries like Papua New Guinea, countries like Vietnam, countries like the Philippines, countries like Myanmar, countries like India, countries like China. That's where we want more Australians to be going, to be learning the culture, learning the language, learning the customs, and doing business and engaging. And that's a long-term challenge. I mean, we don't have as many people pursuing studies, disciplines, subjects in that area as I'd like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on the point around representation of these views in politics as well. young people are concerned about their lack of representation within the political system outside of, getting their views heard, more than any other generation. Why do you think that is? And what can you and other political leaders do to address this?
Well, I think, so look, I think the main political parties have youth wings, and that is a way for people to have their views heard and engage in the political system. And usually for the major political parties, for Labor and the Liberals, it's often a pathway to elected office, to representative office as well. So that's why I said, I'd encourage people, particularly if they're interested in political representation, to get involved with a party, whichever one suits your own political preferences and ideologies, because we could do with younger people in Parliament. The other point I make, though, is, I worry about our politics. Our elected representatives often follow too narrow a career pathway. There's increasingly a tendency towards a professional political class in Australia. That is, people who haven't done anything else except politics. So they've come up through a political movement. They've then worked in a political office or for a politically aligned think tank or a trade union or something like that. And then they've gone straight into elected office. And look, every political system has these sorts of insiders, but if we get too many insiders, we're not getting a parliament that genuinely reflects the diversity of Australia. And we're not getting people bringing in, a wealth of experiences that they should. So on the one hand, I'm saying get involved, join the young political parties, join the youth wings of them. But on the other, I'm also saying don't be a political tragic and don't sort of be all-consuming that. Go and build a career, do something, bring something from outside into politics, because that's what we need. We need people who've been nurses, teachers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, stay-at-home carers, aged care workers, because you notice it when you're in the parliament that people bring perspectives that reflect their own community, but also their own life experience. So, I've a good friend of mine in Parliament, Fiona Martin, she's a childhood psychologist, and she's got great perspectives and insights to offer on a whole lot of social policy and youth issues. And I'll often ask for her expertise because it's a world that I'm not familiar with enough, but she is. And then, I'll get people coming to talk to me about, foreign affairs and international relations and national security, because obviously that's my expertise and perspective. And we need people of different age groups as well. And we do have young people in Parliament. I mean, there's people in there on my side of politics. I don't know if there's anyone in their 20s, but there's quite a lot of people in their 30s. And there's people up to their late 60s. And I think that's good. And Labor side would be the same. So, we need a parliament that's as diverse as Australia is. And that's age, gender, professional background, ethnicity, religion, disability, all those sorts of things. We don't yet have a parliament that looks and feels like the rest of Australia does, but we need to work towards it. And part of that is making sure we've got more young people there.
Yeah. And on that vein, how did your personal experience navigating new cultures at a young age influence your career journey to date?
Yeah, so I've always, my story is my father's Indian, ethnically Indian, but born in Trinidad and Tobago. My mother's third or fourth generation Anglo-Australian. They met in London. I was born in Canada, and then I came here as about a 4-year-old in the late 1970s. So I feel culturally Australian. I grew up as an Australian. I can kind of I can pass as Australian as anyone, except I've got I don't have an Anglo name. My full name's Devanand Sharma, and I've got a different ethnic background and things like that. But I think what it means is I've always approached Australia partly as an insider, but also partly as an outsider, because my dad's perspective in particular as a migrant who came here gave me his sense of Australia as a foreign country. And then I spent a lot of time representing Australia overseas. And when you do that, you look back at your own country and you compare and you contrast and you see the strengths and weaknesses. And so I think it means that I'm often comparing Australia to other countries, sometimes favourably, sometimes unfavourably. I think it means I'm conscious of some of the big things we've got right in our society. And I mentioned the multicultural elements. I think that's a big part of it. I think social mobility, we do quite well in Australia. I think avoiding the worst elements of sort of political polarisation and partisanship, we do well in Australia. But I also see some of our weaknesses, and I think some of our weaknesses, to me, boil down to taking things for granted or being complacent. Because you know, on sort of in the grand scheme of things, we're an incredibly fortunate country in which to live or be born. But I think sometimes that means that we think that that's sort of preordained and it will always be us, and it doesn't really matter what decisions we take or what level of engagement we have with the political system. You know, Australia runs on autopilot, and it's not true. There's lots of examples of countries around the world that have been, you know, prosperous, wealthy, safe, secure, tolerant, pluralistic, and they run off the rails for all sorts of reasons, because ideas take hold or forces take hold and they grow, and people end up discounting the value of what they've got in the pursuit of something that they think might be better, which ends up being far worse. And I'm always mindful of that as Australian. This probably means why I'm on the conservative side of politics, because I'm conscious about preserving what we've got as much as I am about wanting to improve it for the future.
Fantastic. And on that note, I really want to thank you, Dave, for joining us today for this interview. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Anorah. Thank you for testing me with all your questions.